Well, thanks very much. I'm an old man, and I'm used to sitting at presentations and not standing now. So bear with me. What's that? You know, that's the bargain here. Paul, thanks. No, that's okay. I'm going to stand. I don't want to, at this point, sit down. I'm simply noting that I often sit, and I'm happy to stand here and talk to you for a few minutes. It is much better for me. First of all, I'm delighted to be here. Thanks to Jack and Bassam for inviting me. I haven't seen Bassam for many years. It's too long. I was his doctoral dissertation advisor. You know, suddenly in this career, you suddenly have these students who have gone on to become professors. They're your family, right? I mean, they're like your sons and daughters. They're your extended family. And it's a tremendous thing because you pass on this heritage, but then what we expect of our students is that they move ahead and they're better than us. And Bassam is precisely that. They're going to make advances, and they always have amazing ways of surprising us. I was at Stanford last week, and I saw Hisham Saddam, my other student from, I have several, but another student of mine from Georgetown, and the same could be said about Hisham. So I'm delighted to be here and to see many good and long-standing, I won't say old, long-standing friends in the room as well. I have a tremendously big subject to talk about. I want to say, first of all, when it comes to what's next, I have no idea. My late father was a Sovietologist, and he used to say that he predicted things after the events. I mean, he was always sure they were going to happen, post-happen, you know. So I feel that whatever happens, it was inevitable. But I think the prediction game is very challenging, I have to say. And that is particularly the case when it comes to Iran. Now, here's the dirty little secret. I suppose you could say I trained as an Arabist back in the day. And then when I was at graduate school, I suddenly ran into somebody who said, look at Iran. I said, oh my gosh, this is an interesting place. So I ended up writing a book on Iran. And then I've ended up editing with Farid Farhi, an edited collection on internal social and political change in Iran. And so, like the third episode of The Godfather, I keep getting pulled back into the Iranian sort of orbit. And so I'm happy to speak as a non-expert expert on Iran. Let me say that I want to talk very briefly about the challenges of transition politics in Iran. What I mean by this is, what I mean by transition politics are struggles over redefining the social and political contract, struggles over how to redefine the political game. These may eventuate in democratization, in political liberalization, or the reassertion of authoritarianism. But these are struggles, and they take a long time to happen. And the fact of the matter is, they're indeterminate. We cannot easily predict what the outcome is. And more times than none, they don't necessarily lead to democratization. When I was at Stanford, I was with Larry Diamond, and Larry's very upset. I mean, I understand this, because we don't have a world of democracy, and Larry's like a committed man. I'm just an academic. I'm not sure I'm committed, but Larry's, and so the expectations are high, so the depression is intense, right? I mean, it hasn't happened. There's a democratic deficit. But I would say that democratization is the exceptional sort of case often. And struggles and the reassertion of autocracy and messes, I mean, this is more the rule than the exception. So we shouldn't be surprised to learn that democratization is hard. And democratic revolutions are hard as well. I mean, there's almost a contradiction in talking about a democratic revolution, because transitions where they are successful, what I mean by transition games, taking the word from Jaworski, are games in which there are struggles between oppositions and within oppositions and ruling elites. And these struggles have to do with arriving at accommodations. If there's going to be a transition, there's going to be a political pact, an arrangement, some sort of bargain, some sort of agreement by which elements of the old regime are brought into the new. That's not a revolution. That's an accommodation. And the only case where we find in the Arab world where this has happened, and its consolidation is not obvious, is, of course, Tunisia. It's really hard to do. And it's really hard to do for many reasons. Some of them are social, and some of them, as I've argued in a book that is in Mark's, one of Mark's many books, I mean, I don't want to start counting here, but one of his edited books is that transition politics are complicated when they pivot around identity struggles. because it's very hard to bargain over identity. It's very hard to come to some sort of agreement about how to divide the pie. We're not talking economics. We're not even talking sheer political power. We're talking the struggle over national identity. So in Tunisia, they spent months talking about Article 1 of the Constitution. 3 words hung up the whole thing because they mattered to people. And how you ended up defining those words had a lot to do with where Tunisia would go. So these are really hard. And they're hard in Iran. Why are they hard in Iran? Well, I'm going to tell you very briefly what about Iranian politics I think facilitates transition politics, opens up the space for bargains, and at the same time, what I think really works against those sort of bargains. And I have to say, my thesis, my argument, my basic point, it won't surprise you, is that there are more factors working against bargains than facilitating bargains. And particularly the regional and global context has really undermined the capacity of Rouhani. Because Rouhani came, when he was elected in 2013, real surprise, of course, in the Washington policy arena. And he had high expectations. He really thought he would reignite the Khatami agenda and reignite transition politics. He expected to do so. When I saw him with a lot of other people in New York at the UN meeting, he was bouncing off the ground. And so Javad Zarif really is bouncing off the ground. And there was such intense joy and expectation. And it's just been swept away by one thing, particularly Syria, by the Iranian gambit in Syria. But anyway, let's go back and just briefly enumerate what facilitates transition dynamics in Iran. What is it about the system? Well, first of all, the system is a dissonant system. By that I mean it's a system not based on the idea of a theocracy, but on multiple notions of authority and legitimacy. And those multiple notions of authority and legitimacy are institutionalized in many arenas, including in elections and in the parliament. So Iranian politics has always been about bargaining, and particularly bargaining over economic and social policies. It's much more difficult to bargain about politics because that's about first principles, but often economic and social bargains are a surrogate for politics. And we saw this under Khatami, and I'm sure Rouhani was expecting to sort of re-engage in that. So the dissonant nature of the politics, the parliament, the fact that you have a fluid system of alliances and factions can facilitate this sort of bargaining process. And so there are aspects of the Iranian sort of arena that really create a potential for bargaining. And of course, the role of what are called the reformists, the Islamic left, they go by different names, the fact that it was part of the revolutionary family means that there's a key bargainer that is attached to the revolutionary elite. And so there has been space, and that allowed for Khatami to reassert himself. But of course, Khatami was defeated by the retrenchment, the reaction of the hardliners. So I want to get to sort of, if we mention the facilitating aspects, again, a dissonant ideology, a parliament that is meaningful, where there are elections and bargaining over all kinds of policies, a fluid system of factional alliances, which is always changing, but has allowed for considerable bargaining, particularly over economic and social policy. These are kinds of factors that have facilitated a kind of a politics of detour. And what I mean by politics of detour in the title is that Iran constantly gets close to some sort of transition, and then it gets knocked off the road. Tries to build another road, it gets knocked off the road. And this is an incentive, a system of that is sort of almost institutionalized now. You know, when I was a student in Egypt a million years ago, they used to talk about Egypt being in a marhala intikaliya, right? A transitional phase, mustamira. I mean, it just never ended, right? You know, and I think Iranians feel like that's where they are now. It's the politics of transition detours that are not adding up to the kinds of expectations that the advocates of change want. Even if we consider, by the way, the recent protests that have occurred in many cities, 400 or 500 cities, mostly outside Tehran, which are really significant because they happen outside the gambit of the reformist movement and the official parties and movements. But unless there's an alliance between the leaders of those protests and elements within the regime, it's hard to create the kind of momentum that will create a transition politics. And the hardliners are banking on this, and so far they're correct. I have to say, so far they're correct. So let's get into the sort of factors that work against the kind of democratic bargains, the political transition politics that I mentioned before. Well, one is, of course, that Iran is not an electoral autocracy. It is not an electoral autocracy. It is a veto system in which the security apparatus, the Pasdaran, and the supreme leader and his allies in the clerical establishment can veto anything the parliament wants and shut down any process of transition politics when it chooses to do so. The mechanism of electoral competition doesn't allow for the kinds of transition dynamics we've seen, for example, in Mexico with the PRI. It's really hard to produce that because it's a veto system. And the role of the Rahbar, the supreme leader, they don't call him supreme for nothing, right, is critical to sort of maintaining a control mechanism on this process. Second of all, some aspects that encourage transition politics undermine them. The fluidity of the party system, it's not a party system, the fluidity of the factional system, it's too fluid. It's like Jell-O hammered against the wall. Iranians have a great deal of challenges for all kinds of reasons in forming stable political parties, and factions are not parties. Of course, the regime has outlawed the participation party, and that's just one example. The participation party was never a party; it was 16 factions within one party. So it's really hard to coalesce in an alliance. If you're looking for allies in the regime and you can't create stable parties in the opposition, it's really hard to produce this. So fluidity is great for certain kinds of negotiations, but it doesn't add up to the kind of political momentum and institutionalization that you need to create a dynamic of negotiations that will sustain a real political opening. Because I'm looking for modest changes. I'm just looking at this point for some hope that there might be a political opening that would sort of reverse the retrenchment that we've seen in Iran in the last 10 or 15 years. I mean, that's my modest expectation, so I don't get too disappointed if it doesn't work out. But there's a final element in all of this that really has to be factored in, and that is the Syrian intervention, the Iranian intervention in Syria. I mean, I do not think, by the way, I'm not a subscriber to conspiracy theories or to the notion that the Iranians had any notion of where they'd end up when they went into Syria. For the Iranians, they have a military treaty with Assad. They see Assad's survival as fundamental to the strategic interests of Iran. I get that. And when it looked like Assad was going to fall, and our former president said was counting the minutes, remember that? Which probably wasn't a good idea, but in any case, that's another matter. Counting out loud is not good. At that point, the Iranians said, well, we're going in to save this regime. They went in there, it didn't work out very well. So the Russians came in to save the Iranians so they could save Assad's regime. That was the sort of trajectory. The Iranians couldn't do it, Hezbollah couldn't do it. The Russians have certain assets that really facilitated all this. But I'm sure that Hassan Rouhani, 2 minutes, perfect. When he came into office, he had this notion of the wave. It was going to be this movement of peace and prosperity, and he really thought this was going to happen. It was like Khatami Part 2, but he was going to be more clever than Khatami, in terms of alliance politics in particular. And what happened, Iran gets caught in this sort of swamp of Syrian struggle. It abets these massive human rights abuses, and of course, in that context, Rouhani is sidelined. I mean, he's struggling against this, but he's largely sidelined. And the international agreement on nuclear arms doesn't reverse this. It only provokes a hardline response to Rouhani in the context of the escalating battle in Syria. So the context means that Iran is involved in what it sees as an existential struggle, largely against Wahhabi Islam. They see Assad as their protector against the spread of Wahhabism, and he's going to survive come what may. And they've actually, obviously, kept their word in that regard. But to conclude, the regional context has really made Rouhani's aspirations hard to realize. And my feeling is that until, and this is to echo some points made by other presenters this morning, until this escalation of sectarianism, the way in which the United States is abetting this, and other factors sort of eventuate to reverse this, what I think is a very bad direction now for the Middle East, with the possibility of an Iranian-Israeli war involving the Saudi, who knows, right? This is going to be really bad for any even conception of some process of liberalization and political opening revolving around some sort of negotiated understanding in Iran. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Sorry for the...
That's okay. I love standing.